Good evening and welcome to tonight's meeting. This is a public meeting and members of the public and press are permitted to report on the proceedings. Reporting includes filming, photography and making audio recording and providing commentary on proceedings. Please note that this meeting is recorded and streamed live. These recordings are published on the relevant pages of the Council website. By choosing to attend this public meeting, you are deemed to have given your consent to be filmed or recorded and for any footage to be broadcast or published. If an alarm sounds, the premises must be evacuated immediately. Do not spend time collecting personal belongings. All emergency escape routes are clearly signed. Once you have left the building, the assembly point is on the High Street opposite the Guildhall. Members and other speakers are reminded to use their microphones when speaking. Do we have any substitutes? Nope. Any public speakers? No. Any declarations of interest? Do we have any public participation? No. Well, we'll go on to the minutes then. Those who were present last time might like to confirm whether or not these are fair and accurate minutes. Should we start with page 1? Page 2? Page 3? Page 4? Page 5? And lastly, page 6. Any, would someone like to confirm that this is an accurate proposed and seconded? Seconded. Thank you. So we now move on to item 5, report of the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman.
Thank you, Chair. Members will be aware that one of the functions of this committee is to review reports of the Ombudsman when findings of maladministration have been made against the Council. And some members will recall that we've been in the very healthy position that for the last 2 years we've reported at the end of the year no adverse findings against the Council, so for 2 consecutive years. However, I do have 2 adverse findings to report to you tonight. Now we're in this new municipal year. It's important that the committee review these matters and are satisfied that the Council has adequate procedures, policies, a culture in place to ensure that incidents like this can genuinely be viewed as isolated mistakes. Clearly, in terms of our overall approach to complaints whether they progress to the Ombudsman or not, we are genuinely committed to learning from complaints, and I've brought reports to other committees, including recently the Planning Committee, to demonstrate how we go about doing that and how we take the learning and get right into the detail. In relation to these 2 complaints, I think that there's one thing that they're very, very different, but one thing that does unite them is that the Council's willing to take the learning from them, but does view them as rather isolated incidents on their own particular facts. But if I just introduce them both one by one, and then perhaps we just take the questions after that. So the first relates to a customer who made a complaint about his experiences in our contracted leisure services, which, as members will know, are operated by Freedom Leisure. And his complaint related to the process that had been applied in the leisure centre's decision to ban him from their premises for a period of time. And the Ombudsman did not look at the merits of the ban, and the Ombudsman did not make findings about the ban. The ban related to behaviour and conduct. The Ombudsman looked instead at the process by which the customer could have known whether a ban was foreseeable, and the process that he would have been put through in terms of Freedom's decision-making process around a ban. And in relation to that specifically, the original ban was that Freedom instigated at the first stage of their procedures was a permanent one, and then on appeal that was overturned and was a 12-month ban, and that has now expired and the customer is permitted to use the facilities again. The Ombudsman looked at it through the lens of a customer and customers' rights, and was clear that whilst the Leisure Centre does have terms and conditions for membership, they didn't consider that the customer complaints policy was clear enough as to how customer complaints would be dealt with, whether when a customer's behaviour may be viewed as inappropriate or unacceptable, how that will be considered, and rights of appeal and so forth. So clearly, I mean, some members will be aware that in these sorts of matters, the Ombudsman does hold the council to quite a high standard as a public body, and says, yeah, customer, you know, there's always your sort of legal framework around consumer protection, but in the context of a council contracted out service, the Ombudsman says, well, that's within our jurisdiction, and for a public body operating these services at arm's length, was the process reasonable enough? When the customer complained, initially he did, having been through the process of the original permanent ban and then that being overturned internally to the 12-month ban, he did then complain to the council. And we ensured that that was reviewed fully as a stage 1 and a stage 2 complaint, because the customer made a number of complaints relating potentially to discrimination, and I was very concerned that we had a really close look at it. At the council's stage 1 and stage 2 complaints process, we did find a couple of things that we thought could have been improved around the handling of witness evidence and facilitating a comfortable hearing and people feeling prepared and so forth. But the review officers at stage 1 and 2 did not feel that that had led to an unfair or discriminatory outcome or process. So the council had determined that the customer's complaint should therefore not be upheld. But that was when the customer then referred the matter to the Ombudsman, who took a different view. And as I say, their finding is limited to focusing on the Leisure Centre's policy for customer complaints, not the merits of the original decision. So that's that one. Shall I move on to the other, or pause there, Chair? What would you prefer?
I think
Pause.
we'll take yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I think I get what Sean's saying, and we've got that responsibility to our public, our customers, but also to our staff. And what I'm slightly concerned about in this is the amount I don't know, and because of the amount I don't know, not that I want to, but whether we're missing a sort of learning opportunity, really. I'm perfectly happy to recognise the status of the Ombudsman and the judgment. But it seems to me that somewhere in the details I don't know, a person, either through perception or misperception, has been quite offended, and someone else has thought that there's such gravity to that a significant step should be taken. Now, I think I'd be happy if the Chair, Vice Chair, could just, not a report or anything like that, but just in their own time reflect on it and see if generically there's something we might learn from this. I know that there's always the procedures, but people always fall back onto procedures. I didn't know we weren't allowed to do that. Well, but it's just something for the protection of our staff, whether we ought to just see if there's any wrinkles and perhaps not even report back, but perhaps do what's necessary to say that we're securing their safety. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. So I personally think that it should be very carefully done when we look at the procedure changes that come in on the back of this. I think we don't want to have to be very, very prescriptive about what would constitute a ban, lifetime ban in this case, as opposed to perhaps, I don't know, I don't want to put words in the mouth of the people who are going to write this, but perhaps not breaking the law. I don't know, is that in a suitable way, you know, keeping within the law at all times? Pardon?
Lawfulness.
Lawfulness. I mean, I don't know, could I just ask the chair whether she agrees with that, and maybe Charles?
Yes, certainly. I do think perhaps we might need to, has the city considered how it will apply to all its contractors rather than just this one specific contractor? Surely it's going to be a broad thing, but it's also got to be a reasonable judgment of behaviour, of expected behaviour of, for instance, anybody who might wander in off the street and be abusive to the staff in the front foyer. What would we consider to be acceptable, and do we have that just publicly displayed, perhaps?
Yes, thank you, members. I think that it's certainly the case that the Ombudsman held the City Council to a higher standard than it would have done a private leisure operator. I'm quite sure of that myself, and I think that's that public body kind of gold standard. I think that's what's been applied. You mentioned the point about, you know, behaviour in other contexts, like in our buildings, and it does give me pause to reflect, because I have had to ban somebody very recently from this building on health and safety grounds following police attendance. We do have a very simple sort of document poster that we provide to people. There's a sort of a charter type point about, it's not quite 3 strikes, but, you know, about the escalation of behaviour and giving people a chance to escalate back down again. It is difficult because, you know, circumstances will be so varied, and I think in instances where it's necessary to take immediate action, like the one I was faced with recently, I don't think anyone would think it was unreasonable for me to have warned him on one occasion, and on the third occasion with police attendants, to ban him. But I think in this instance, what the Ombudsman's reflecting is that a customer who has his own requirements and needs had a relationship with the leisure centre as a customer, which the Ombudsman decided hadn't been perhaps sufficiently taken into account when that process of reviewing his behaviour was before them. I mean, I suppose the only other thing I can say is that, you know, we did have a really good look at it at stage 1 and stage 2, because we were concerned about, you know, discrimination, and we were concerned about what it was saying, and I had a lot of confidence in the 2 different officers who reviewed it, who many of you would know as managers in the council. And they were satisfied that the process was reasonable. So, you know, sometimes we do disagree with the Ombudsman. I think that there is something, though, on the wider point about behaviour and escalation of behaviour, and it is probably time for the council to review its sort of policy on that. And ordinarily, where you'd find our policy on unreasonable behaviour would be in our complaints policy, which is fine if it's a complaint, but if it isn't a complaint. So I think there's probably an action for us there, and all of these things are about fairness, having adequate information, having the chance to step away and reflect. Those sorts of behaviours would therefore make something a more fair process. So yes, very happy to look at that, Chair, but as I say, I tend to think it is fairly isolated on its facts, this one.
Are you satisfied with that, Andy? Were you satisfied with that answer? Sorry. Were you satisfied with that response? We'll catch it on YouTube later. Roger?
Yes, thank you. I've come from a similar position to Andy, but I think we only get half the story with these things, because something happened to generate this incident, and that isn't being examined. I mean, was the behaviour of the individual reasonable or unreasonable? You know, we are being criticised as when I say we, I'm no longer a member of the City Council, but the City Council are being criticised for something that we don't know whether or not the criticism was right, wrong, or just completely inappropriate. Something happened, and we only get half the story. I don't know whether this is right, wrong, or indifferent, to be honest.
Yes, thank you. I understand the point you're making, and again, the Ombudsman requires us to have these debates in the public domain, but also in any event, even if we were having a private briefing, I should properly direct you to the fact that the Ombudsman was only looking at the process and not the merits. So it was that feeling of, this person was a consumer and a customer nevertheless, and that the Ombudsman didn't feel that that process was transparent enough and fair enough. So, you know, in that regard, it is what it is. And we see that with other matters, don't we? So again, if we just think of another example where we felt a little bit more troubled a couple of years ago than we do now in relation to planning complaints, sometimes people will be sore about the outcome and the process, you know? And if the determination relates to planning merits, that's all very well. But if they feel that the process hasn't been done properly, that makes them, that's a different level of complaint. And those were the sorts of Ombudsman complaints we were getting before, which happily are long behind us. So I think it is, in that instance, it was process, yeah. But it was, I think, rather isolated on its facts.
Yeah, I think it was rather more the consumer rights rather than the original issue that was being handled. Yeah, no, I understand. Which was, I don't think was in dispute.
So, Chair, I just turn to the second finding against the Council. So this relates to a private sector housing matter, and members will be aware that the private sector housing team in the City Council exercises a range of powers and some duties under the legislation. So some things that we have a kind of option to do and some things that we have an obligation to do. Where complaints are made or there are reasons to have, you know, enforcement concerns about standards in private rented properties, and those standards are set out in housing legislation and subsequent regulations. So the standards are well known, they're nationally applied, they're not sort of a matter for local discretion. So the original framework that the private sector housing team work within is these are standards which we expect from private rented properties. And then if those standards are not met, there are a range of options and strategies that the private sector housing team can apply, but some of the process and how they do it is mandatory, things they must do, and some things are optional. And that's generally a bit of a flavour in enforcement legislation generally, about investigating and then deciding what action to take. So there's different stages. Again, this complaint, we're required to publish this. This is caught up in some national debate at the moment about private sector accommodation, and the Ombudsman's been publishing public interest reports where they've gone around the country and found complaints from tenants, largely, where they've thought that the council should have taken more action. So our report, you know, was published on their website, and they required us to actually put a notice in the newspaper, and we've done all of that. In relation to this complaint, the tenant, Miss X, made a complaint about standards in her property and complained that we failed to inspect it properly and didn't update her on the outcome of the inspection, and that she lived longer than was necessary in unhealthy conditions and her belongings were damaged. So there's quite an extensive report in your pack, which I expect you've read. There were remedies against the council. The particular faults, the way that the Ombudsman's findings work is they say, was there a fault and did it lead to injustice? And in the overall process and the chronology of dealing with Miss X's rented property and dealing with her landlord, the two faults that the Ombudsman found against the council, it wasn't the totality of the casework and the file. The two faults, firstly, one related to serving a notice on the landlord and that having been done in the format of an email instead of a formal notice. And secondly, for failing to update Miss X promptly or sufficiently promptly in the Ombudsman's opinion about the progress that the landlord was making in relation to the works. So there was a first point, a technical breach, if you like, about the service of the notice and the format of that. And then latterly, a finding that we should have acted more quickly to update the tenant. So again, I just want to put that into the context. It's not a total service failure in relation to Miss X's complaint. The remedies that the Ombudsman recommended were an apology, that's been provided, an offer to make a payment, that offer has been made several times, that offer's not been taken up, but that offer has been made. To provide an update on the enforcement investigation, to keep Miss X informed, which we have been doing, to amend our investigation procedure to make sure it's explicit, you know, I said about powers and duties, to make sure it's explicit that upon finding a category hazard, we must take enforcement action, which is implied, but it didn't say that. And I think reading other councils, not a lot, but some councils had really gone on the front foot and said, if we find this, we will do this. And I think, again, from customers' point of view, that's very clear, isn't it? So we weren't saying we wouldn't do it, we just weren't explicitly saying, if we find a hazard, we will take action. So that was missing, so we've corrected that. And the Ombudsman recommended that we undertook more training for staff, so that the kind of, you know, the importance of those particular stages of the investigation enforcement procedure were really clear. Now, when I put it in that context, I don't want you to think that the private sector housing team don't know their way around the legislation. They know it very well, but a lot of enforcement teams, whether that's private sector housing, reg services, planning enforcement, they operate a couple of stages of enforcement behaviour, which involve kind of trying to encourage and cooperate by consent. So, you know, serving notices is sometimes the right thing to do, but often it should be accompanied by, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? It's carrot, not stick, isn't it? And it's behaviours to try and incentivise and encourage. So I think what the Ombudsman was drawing us back to saying, you know, just don't forget, don't hold back, exercise your duties and serve those notices. I did seek some context from the head of service. It predates his arrival at the council. It covers a period of time where we were managing a high caseload during COVID. I'm not using that as an excuse, but it's the team and the managers and the director and leadership team are satisfied that this is a moment in time which doesn't reflect caseload, and we asked the head of service to audit some caseload to be satisfied that that was not, you know, a trend that would be seen elsewhere. And the head of service wanted to reassure the committee. We have reviewed and amended our policies, procedures and working practices, and are satisfied that these are much more explicit, clear and legally compliant, removing ambiguity and unnecessary interpretation or discretion to ensure a consistent and standardised approach is taken. And I think that's relevant in terms of thinking of the enforcement officers as part of a team with managers. If they know what must be done, they're not exercising that discretion, they're referring it up for a decision because they know that must be done. We've increased capacity in the team. There were resource pressures at the time, and we have provided training to deliver a much more well-resourced service. And in terms of the new management approach, there are regular team meetings and individual one-to-one case reviews to discuss caseloads, to manage oversight of workload. But specifically, because the workload point is relevant to the second element of the complaint, that we didn't keep the customer updated of the progress the landlord was making. And that was simply, frankly, the reason for that was busyness in terms of the caseload. So the team have got a different process in place on their case recording system to trigger them to update customers in terms of the progress that they, I mean, obviously the housing enforcement team won't always know everything that the landlord is doing at the time, but as far as they're aware, they will share that information. And I think that's important to recognise the kind of asymmetry, isn't it, that might exist in terms of the power between the tenant and the landlord. And so the tenant might understandably want to come to the council and say, well, what do you know? What have you heard? You know, if they don't think they're getting the answers. So that's understandable. So the revised policy was taken through our Communities Committee and amended. And the property was inspected after all of the works by an officer and surveyor and signed off as being compliant. We further inspected again in January 2023. Identified other issues, but they were of a less significant nature. The professional judgment was that the property was fit and habitable and no enforcement action was necessary. And again, that's operating within those national standards. That's not just us deciding what the test for fit and habitable is, that's us applying this test. So clearly the council's team is happy to accept that, you know, the kind of rigour of moving from coaching and encouraging into enforcement is a lesson learned on that case. But in other regards, I think they do feel that they have tried hard on this and other cases to keep relationships going between customers and their landlords. So that was my briefing on that one, Chair, to start us off. I mean, obviously there is still a live case in terms of the housing matters, there is quite a large published decision in your pack, but you will forgive me if I need to sort of use personal data as an excuse to sort of call time on any particular question. It's not to be evasive, it's just that it is still a live matter.
Neil?
Is that working? Yep. I have two questions. Shall I ask them both at the same time? Or both of them have a bit of preamble, so apologies for that. I've read a few Ombudsman reports in my time and in my job and previous jobs. This is probably the most emotive report I've ever read. It's pretty damning of the council. It's a shame to have to read it. So the preamble to the first question. I mean, on page 10 of the report, it says that in January this year, the complainant said that the effects of the inaction had, I quote, been devastating. She'd been left unable to function and live in a normal life. Live a normal life even. So that's pretty horrible to read. As a councillor, as someone who's held accountable for the actions of this council. Not that long ago, a 2-year-old called Awa Bishak died in Rochdale. And I think it was the first recorded death in the UK due to damp and mould. And because that was due to the inaction of the social housing provider in Rochdale. And as a result of that death in Rochdale, Michael Gove insisted that the law be changed. So the social housing regulation bill was made more stringent. It compelled social landlords to fix damp and mould within stricter time limits. So that's the preamble to my first question, which is, does this legislation, the social housing regulation bill, the changes to it, does it oblige private housing landlords and councils to fix damp and mould within more stringent timescales? It does with social housing providers. What about private and councils? That's my first question.
Through you, Chair. As far as I am aware, it doesn't apply to private sector landlords, but I will double check and give you a written response, Councillor.
Thank you very much. I think I probably should have done more homework, but I'll leave it to you to have a look at as well. So the second question is regarding page 12, point 59. The Ombudsman concluded that the Council's enforcement policy was legally compliant, but its published investigation procedure was not. The Council has started amending its investigation procedure. So my question is, what progress has there been in terms of amending the Council's enforcement policy?
Through you, Chair. The policy and the investigation procedure is all updated. The policy was approved by committee. The investigation procedure is clear and live on our website.
Apologies if my questions weren't as concise as your answers. Thank you very much.
Marjorie?
On page 12, it says that a low-level category 2 hazard for damp and mould has been identified, and that it has given Miss X advice on how to mitigate the low-level damp. I've read some rather concerning reports in papers, etc., that sometimes the advice given on how to avoid low-level damp really affects, you know, the way people can live in a normal way. Like they can't dry clothes inside. I mean, drying clothes inside is going to exacerbate the problem. But if you live in a flat and it's the middle of winter, then you have to dry clothes inside. It's just, you know, I'm just worried, basically, that this lady is going to carry on suffering.
Through you, Chair, I suppose 2 points to make. One is that that there is still a live case on this in terms of the adequacy of her accommodation and her views about that. It is a live matter. And secondly, this council, in common with the others, follows a framework set nationally as to what the standards are and what steps can be taken and enforced and what processes might be applied. To move category 2 hazards into category 1 and require a higher standard of remedial action would require a change of the legislation.
We're all reasonably intelligent people, and we have no idea what Miss X is like or any other people, but how clear are our explanations? They can be could be considered quite technical. If you say a category 2 hazard, or there's been other terms, and you'd have to go away and look. Is there an explanation provided to people in these cases by the private housing team, or indeed by the social housing? I think it'd be reasonable if you've used a technical term to have that explained.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, I mean, in our procedures published on our investigation procedures in our policy, we do use phrases like that, but we don't only use phrases like that. The reason we use phrases like that is, again, they're these national standards. So for people kind of taking advice externally or Googling round, it's a landing point in terms of understanding what those things mean. But we do explain what those things are and why we're using them. And we've got flowcharts and diagrams as well as the text. I mean, there is no substitute for having face-to-face conversation and people explaining things to you. And our case officers do spend a lot of their time doing face-to-face visits. So we don't have a remote workforce in that regard. We're not reliant on our web pages or anything like that. It's a, you know, there's a lot of face-to-face contact.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have a friend who's dyslexic, and obviously, you know, it is difficult, and they're often quite embarrassed to ask for assistance, and so these face-to-face meetings are very useful.
And again, Chair, I'm grateful you picked up that point, because I just want to sort of make or remember and make the offer, I guess, whilst we're sort of on the record, that anybody who's struggling with access for any reason can let their case officer know, whether that's on a housing matter, a planning matter, any matter, or let 89 High Street, the customer services, know on the general number, or come in and tell us. And we have got lots of examples in the 12 months where we've put something in place if somebody tells us what their access requirement is. It's difficult to accommodate, to anticipate everything that's going to need accommodating. But if somebody or on their behalf makes the call, then we will absolutely meet their needs, yeah. Thank you, Chair. So this is the time of year where we bring the annual report looking back at the previous year. So for some members of the committee, this will be very familiar, and for others, it's a new briefing on what was going on here last year. And in terms of what the Standards Committee was considering last year, I think there was a reasonable workload around policy. It was a fairly cerebral year, I think, in terms of policy, government discussion, and you know, the sort of ebbs and flows of this of the debates about standards. I mean, I guess again, to put that in context, the local government standards regime is largely set out in the Localism Act 2011, and that is a more light touch regime than the one that preceded it for many years in terms of a standards board. Localism Act, I guess the clue's in the name. The intention was always that standards matters would be determined locally. That's the framework of that legislation. You know, the Standards Committee that we have at this council, its functions are set out in the Constitution. It has a leadership role in terms of promoting and maintaining high standards. It gives advice on codes of conduct and looks at complaints matters, as we've talked about. It supports arranging training and reviews at a high level reports from the monitoring officer about complaints upheld or considered under the code of conduct. So there's a range of function relating to ethical standards. And in terms of what this committee considered in the last 12 months, as I've mentioned previously, for that period, there weren't any findings against the council at all from the Ombudsman, so there was no matters there for the committee to consider. The code of conduct for members, however, I think a lot of us were quite happy to reach a conclusion on that, which had become a bit of a journey piece of work in terms of iterations and, you know, time spent in draft, and I think we were keen to get that concluded. The model code of conduct that we've adopted is the local government associations with a model code with a couple of variations. This committee supported that going up to full council, and it was finally adopted at full council on the 28th of March 2023. It's largely still a Worcestershire-wide code, but there are now a couple of local variations, which isn't where we were last time around, but is just is a pragmatic conclusion to some of the different local sort of preferences that people had. But, you know, most paragraphs are the same, carbon copy across Worcestershire and carbon copy with Local Government Association. So we also considered as I said, the sort of ebbs and flows of the adequacy of the Localism Act and the debate that goes on about whether ethical standards in public life should be enhanced, and particularly for our focus in local government. And I reminded the committee that the Nolan Committee had written some time ago to the government with a whole series of recommendations for how to improve ethical standards in local government. And long-serving members of the committee will remember that quite a lot of those recommendations we adopted and put in our procedures. And they may be viewed as small things, but they were important. They were things like making sure that a council's whistleblowing procedure, it's clear that it can be used by members of the public as well as employees. It was points like that, you know, making sure that the independent person for standards, Mr. Ray Needham here tonight, is involved in filtering all complaints against members under the Member Code of Conduct. We do that already, but that's explicit. Things like making sure that we've got criteria when we're filtering complaints, and so we're applying the same criteria. So those sort of best practice things were things that we did. So it wasn't difficult. And again, that's a Worcestershire-wide approach. So there were a number of things that the Nolan Committee had said councils should get on and do, and we have done those, and we've done all of those. But the Nolan Committee also said to government, we think there should be legislative changes. For example, and most notably, we think the sanctions regime, if there is a finding under the code, should be more stringent. And the Nolan Committee also asked the government to look again at conduct outside of serving as a councillor. So, you know, whilst not on duty, whether that should be caught by the code or not, and those sorts of matters, asked the government to look at those again. And I reported back to committee last time we met that the government had written back and concluded that it didn't want to make any changes to the framework as is, and that they weren't going to be progressing any of those recommendations, with the exception of one, which was that they recognised that the personal safety of councillors is a much more significant issue now perhaps than it ever used to be. So they agreed that the provision that is in the Localism Act, which is quite restrictive around whether you when you declare your interests, you know, whether you need to declare your property that you live at and so forth, that they were really much more the government is supportive of the idea that that legislation should be changed and softened so that if people don't want to declare their personal address, they don't have to. I have since learnt that some monitoring officers have already taken the view that, you know, you can apply that provision in the Localism Act quite sensibly and view that phrase sensitive interest to mean people who do feel a risk of threat and you know, take a protective view and already say you don't need to put your home address on the record. So I thought it was an interesting learning point, and obviously when we do the annual declarations, we would encourage members to tell us if they had any concerns. So anyway, that was the ethical framework. So the summary of that is that there are no changes planned to standards in local government. Another piece of business that we did at the committee was to refresh the dispensations that are given under the Localism Act. Dispensations being permissions effectively to vote on matters that you may otherwise be considered to have a pecuniary interest in. And so we've got our list of dispensations. They relate to things that affect the generality of the member body, determining allowances, housing benefits, ceremonial offices, council tax. And I'd identified that those hadn't been updated for some time. So we just refreshed those, updated those, and council endorsed those. Again, as a measure to protect members, really, when those matters are voted on, there's clearly, there's clearly a dispensation already in place. And it was agreed that individual dispensations relating to a particular councillor's interest would be delegated to the monitoring officer to be exercised in consultation with the chair and vice chair of Standards Committee. We also considered complaints regarding under the Code of Conduct against councillors. And again, I'm sure the committee will be aware that because of personal data, unless a complaint is upheld against an individual councillor, the details will not be reported in the public domain. And again, I would just note that that procedure is consistent with, if you like, with the employment context. If you were subject to a disciplinary in terms of the employment relationship, you wouldn't expect that to be publicised around your workplace. Councillors obviously are in the public domain. There's a lot of scrutiny, but the law is quite settled that, you know, there are rights of privacy as well. And until there's a finding made against somebody, that should be regarded as a private process. Nevertheless, we do report trend data and information, and the chair and vice chair of the committee have a higher right to know, and information about complaints, the nature of the complaints, the individuals involved, is shared with the chair and vice chair of the committee. One complaint went to a hearing subcommittee last year, and the panel who determined that heard the evidence, weighed up the evidence, and decided that there was no case to answer, and the complaint should be dismissed. I think, Chair, I probably rambled on for long enough. There is a section in there on gifts and hospitalities. I think that really hasn't been a feature at Worcester. I'm probably jinxing it by saying that, but I think that really hasn't been a feature at Worcester or Worcestershire for a number of years, declaration of gifts and hospitality. I'm going to regret saying that, aren't I? But there we are. But I just end on a high, which is that we've talked a number of times about civility and the challenges of being in the public eye, and the challenges of keeping the rhetoric pleasant and civil. And we have got training. We've got an in-person training session for city and county councillors on Wednesday night at County Hall, delivered by Beth Evans. And there is an online session on the 10th of July, and I was going to extend the invitation of that to our parish council colleagues as well, if you'd be interested in sitting in on the online training session. So I send the details through for that. So yes, I think that's probably a fairly comprehensive summary of the annual report last year. I don't think in that I actually mentioned the fact that we updated the procedures for investigating complaints, but we did that too. Thank you, Chair.
Sounds like a busy year for even though it is very worthwhile, I think, every now and then stepping back and reviewing your procedures just to see if they continue to be fit to purpose, because they do. I work in the UCAS test laboratory, and we have to do ours every 3 years. Is one of the things that and you do get pulled up if you don't. Well, I'd like to thank my predecessors and everybody who was on that committee.
Sorry, Chair, Marjorie made me sit in the corner, so you can't see me. I wonder if you could explain a contradiction that I've just noticed in the report. Another awkward question, that's what I'm here for. I'm not just a mascot. On page number 1, it says, under the Localism Act, on the report, sorry. No, it's page 3, sorry, page 3. Under the Localism Act, local authorities are responsible for their own standard arrangements. But then in the conclusion, on page 8, it says, the council does not have any powers itself to enhance or modify the local ethical standards framework. So I'm probably missing something really basic here, but could someone more informed than me explain that apparent contradiction? Thank you.
Sorry, Councillor Lawrenson, it's just not clear from my drafting. we must operate within the Localism Act framework. What we're not able to do, regrettably, even if we wanted to, was impose any additional local standards. What I meant was we have responsibility for conducting all matters that fall within the Localism Act. But when I reach the conclusion section, I'm reflecting on the fact that there's been a debate between the Nolan Committee and the government about enhancing that Localism Act framework. And I don't know what the sporting metaphor would be, but at the moment, you know, in terms of the scoreboard, Nolan Committee aren't doing very well. So where we are with that is what I'm saying in my concluding report is even if we wanted to do more, we can't. So that's what I was trying to get to.
That's presumably to have a normalisation across the entire country.
I think it's because standards is quite an emotive issue and it does engage other legal provisions like the Human Rights Act. I think a lot of councils and a lot of, if I can use that awful word, stakeholders in and around councils do support an enhancement of the regime and clarity as well in some instances about off-duty and on-duty and things like that. And also the declaration of interests regime. So for example, the Nolan Committee and the Local Government Association agreed, said to government, well, one thing you could do that's painless is take away this sort of sword of Damocles that if you don't declare a financial interest, that's a criminal offence, you know, because that's how it's written at the moment. There's no subtlety in that about what the circumstances were and the sort of escalation of that or sliding scale. And the Nolan Committee and the Local Government Association agreed and provided evidence as to why they thought that had been inappropriately drafted. It was probably trying to cover some very egregious behaviour, but it's a sort of it's a hair trigger. So that was one example where the Nolan Committee and Local Government Association said, well, you could just fix that, you know, even if you don't want to tighten up the you know, this kind of sanctions, you could just fix a few of those things. I think, you know, again, parliamentary programme, or what's that phrase they use about parliamentary time, I don't think this has been given priority in terms of debating the finer points. And you can read, Nolan Committee have got an excellent website, really, really good website. They keep that up to date. And you can read the chair's blog. He's very passionate about these issues and he's not giving up. So, but I'm just reflecting on that report that the current position is we've got what we've got.
So we may have a watch this space. Always. Neil?
Well, I'm afraid I have to take the invitation and make a similar point that I made last meeting, that it's no surprise that the Nolan principles are not top of the priority list for this government. I'll leave it at that.
That's outside of my jurisdiction, I'm afraid. On to item agenda 7.
Sorry, Chair. So just in terms of the recommendations on that annual report then.
I see.
It was consider the draft annual report. I should have said, I'm sorry, that we would then refer that up to full council. No. That's my poor drafting. So we're happy to refer that up to council. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Cheryl.
Yes, sorry, Chair. Yeah, lastly, and this is a very brief report, as I said before, when matters are being progressed, they under the Members' Code of Conduct, there isn't much information we can share in the public domain. I would just report that since March 2023, there have been 2 new complaints. So one was recorded as no action, and the other is being referred to a subcommittee meeting for determination, and that's a live matter for us, Chair.
Thank you. Do you have any?
I don't know. I mean, I'm new on this committee. It's a subcommittee. The subcommittee is presumably formed from members of this committee on an ad hoc kind of a basis, just whoever's available, or?
Yes, thanks, Chair. We've adopted our convention that a subcommittee would have three members if you know, if appropriate. And although this committee, although a subcommittee isn't required to be politically balanced, we've always tried to ensure there is a broad spread of political representation. And we've drawn that membership from those who've been experienced in standards matters one way or the other, or been chair and vice chair. So you've got a couple of colleagues in the room who've served on standard subcommittee a couple of times now. And yeah, absolutely, Julian and I would liaise and approach people. It is difficult to formulate any particular rules around that, other than to say that we would always want to be in a position where we could defend any accusation that the panel was biased or, you know, partisan or whatever. So we would just approach it on that basis. Not that any members, you know, not that I'm suggesting we would get that allegation. And I don't know if other members want to comment, but it does feel like a fairly legal process when we sit there. It feels like a fairly objective. It's not really a policy making, it's an evidential process. So I'm sure lots of members would be very well suited for it. And again, I'm going to jinx it by saying we haven't had many, but yeah, we just typically draw a panel of 3 and look for some coverage. Yeah.
Anybody, well, I haven't been notified of any other business. Does anybody want to raise any other business? Was that yes? Oh, no. Great. Then I think, yeah, I think, thank you everybody for attending, and let's go and enjoy the rest of this lovely evening. I'm sure we've all got the things to attend to.